Alex! She screamed, her voice breaking. I loved you. Everything I did for you. If Isabella hadn't been there, you would have seen me. You would have been mine. But what happens when love turns into obsession? And obsession becomes murder. Broken Heart Skull. This is the chilling story of betrayal, jealousy, and a child's hidden truth that changed everything. The Williams estate stretched across acres of green lawns, fountains, and gardens so carefully arranged they looked like paintings. It was the kind of place most people only saw in glossy magazines. Grand chandeliers, marble staircases, a fleet of cars lined up like jewels in the garage. Yet, inside those walls, the real treasure was not the gold accents or priceless art. It was the love that bound Alexander, Isabella, and their son, Ethan, together. Alexander Williams was the kind of man who turned heads everywhere he went. Tall, broad-shouldered, with a smile that could disarm even his most stubborn business rivals. He was not only handsome but also one of the most powerful billionaires in the country. But at home, none of that mattered. To Isabella, he was simply her husband. To Ethan, he was Daddy, the man who built Lego towers, read bedtime stories, and chased him across the backyard until laughter filled the air. But shadows had begun to creep into this once bright home. Isabella, radiant and graceful, had fallen ill months ago. What began as fatigue quickly turned into something darker. Endless hospital visits had drained her, and though doctors recommended extended stays, Isabella refused. She wanted to remain in her home, in the warmth of her family, where her son could still crawl into bed beside her, and where her husband's hand could hold hers through the long nights. That decision led to the arrival of Claire. Isabella's best friend since childhood, Claire was not only loyal but also a trained nurse. She had practically grown up in their home, and when Isabella's condition worsened, there was no hesitation. Claire moved into the guest room. Her presence was a blessing. She cared for Isabella's fragile body with tenderness, helped Ethan with schoolwork, and often managed the household when Alexander buried himself in work to escape his pain. Despite the smiles they forced for Ethan's sake, an unspoken heaviness hung in the air. Alexander often lingered by Isabella's bedside, staring at her with helpless eyes. Nights were the hardest. Sometimes he would sit in the dark study, glass of wine untouched, replaying memories of their early days together. The laughter, the travels, the promises. Ethan, too young to fully understand, clung to his mother's side, asking innocent questions that tore at Alexander's heart. Mommy, when will you be better? Can we go to the beach again? Isabella would smile weakly, brushing his hair aside, her eyes silently begging for more time. It was still a home of love, but now, shadows walked alongside it. And though none of them spoke it aloud, they all feared the same truth, that love alone might not be enough to keep Isabella with them for long. The evening sun painted the sky in shades of gold and crimson, its fading light spilling through the tall windows of the Williams mansion. Inside Isabella's room, the once vibrant woman lay weak and pale against a sea of white sheets. Her breathing was shallow, yet her eyes still carried that familiar warmth, the same eyes Alexander had fallen in love with years ago. Alexander sat by her side, holding her delicate hand as though it were made of porcelain. He tried to mask his pain with a reassuring smile, but his heart was heavy, weighed down by the unspoken truth that their time together was slipping away. He brushed strands of hair from her forehead, whispering stories of their youth, of stolen kisses by the riverside, of laughter during midnight talks, of the first time she told him she loved him. His words trembled, but he spoke them anyway, desperate to fill the silence with memories that could outlast the night. Isabella's lips curved into a frail smile. Alex! Her voice was barely a whisper, softer than the rustle of the curtains. He leaned closer, his breath hitching as she spoke. Promise me, you'll always love our son, the way I loved you. Tears stung his eyes as he nodded fiercely, clutching her hand tighter. I swear it, Bella. I'll love Ethan with all my heart. He'll never lack for anything. Never. Satisfied, Isabella's eyelids fluttered, and with one last look at the man she had built her life with, she released a soft sigh. In that moment, her soul slipped away, gentle, peaceful, as though she had merely fallen into a deep sleep. Alexander's world shattered. His cry of grief tore through the mansion, echoing against marble walls and silencing every corner of the estate. It was the cry of a man who had gained everything in life, only to lose the one thing he could never replace. Servants wept quietly in the hallways, their sobs mixing with the sound of Alexander's heartbreak. Little Ethan, woken by the commotion, stumbled into the room. His wide eyes searched for his mother, but the stillness told him what words could not. He ran into his father's arms, clinging tightly as though holding on could somehow undo the cruel truth. Alexander held him close, both of them drowning in a silence broken only by tears. That night, the mansion was no longer a palace of joy and love. It became a house of mourning, its walls soaked in grief. And for Alexander, life itself seemed to pause, as if the world had lost all meaning without Isabella's presence. The mansion stood draped in sorrow the next morning. Thick curtains were drawn across the tall windows, shutting out the light of dawn as though even the sun had no place in a house of grief. Servants moved about in silence, their faces swollen from a night of weeping. Somewhere in the quiet, Ethan slept restlessly in Claire's arms, murmuring his mother's name in his dreams. Alexander, however, had not slept. He sat in the study, his face buried in his hands, surrounded by the shadows of memories. The scent of Isabella's perfume still lingered faintly in the air, stabbing him with each breath. His heart ached with the weight of a loss he could not yet fully comprehend. She was gone, and nothing, not wealth, not power, not even his desperate prayers, could bring her back. The sound of tires crunching over gravel snapped him from his thoughts. Moments later, the heavy double doors opened, and Isabella's parents swept in. Mr. and Mrs. Carter were draped in black, their grief written clearly on their faces, but behind the tears burned something sharper: accusation. Mrs. Carter's eyes, red but blazing, locked on Alexander. "Where were you when our daughter took her last breath?" she demanded, her voice trembling with both anguish and anger. Alexander stood slowly, his jaw tight. "I was with her," he replied softly. "She passed in my arms." "That's what you say," Mr. Carter cut in, his voice hard. "But we cannot simply take your word. Our daughter was young, full of life, and now she's gone. We need answers. We demand an autopsy." The words struck Alexander like a blade. He staggered back, disbelief flashing across his face. "An autopsy?" His voice cracked with outrage. "You think I had a hand in her death? You dare accuse me of hurting the woman I loved more than my own life?" Mrs. Carter's lips quivered, but her eyes remained cold. "Love is not proof. Too many stories have been told of wealthy men disposing of their wives when they no longer serve them. We will not bury Isabella until we are certain." Rage boiled inside Alexander, hot and consuming. He clenched his fists, fighting the urge to explode. The sheer insult, the unbearable suggestion that he could ever harm Isabella, ripped at his soul. Yet even through his fury, he saw the grief etched into their faces. They were parents in mourning, desperate for someone to blame, desperate for something to make sense of the senseless. With a voice strained by restraint, Alexander finally said, "If it will give you peace, if it will prove my innocence, then do it. Conduct your autopsy. Tear my heart apart again if you must. But know this, I loved Isabella with every breath in me. Her loss is mine more than anyone else's." For a moment, silence filled the grand hall. Mr. Carter's stern expression faltered, his grief softening his anger. Mrs. Carter lowered her gaze, though her tears continued to fall. The staff standing nearby wept quietly, pained to see a family torn apart by suspicion at the very height of sorrow. As Alexander turned away, his shoulders heavy, Claire stepped forward, her eyes brimming with tears. She placed a gentle hand on his arm, whispering, "You don't have to prove love." Isabella knew, but Alexander said nothing. He walked down the corridor to his room, each step echoing like a drumbeat of despair. He had lost his wife, and now even his devotion to her was being questioned. The mansion, once a home of love, had become a place of doubt, grief, and accusations. And in that moment, Alexander realized that though Isabella's battle had ended, his was only just beginning. Days turned into weeks, and slowly, the once vibrant Williams mansion began to lose its soul. The halls that once echoed with Isabella's laughter now groaned with silence. Chandeliers still glittered above, and the fountains still danced in the gardens outside. But without her presence, everything seemed lifeless. It was as if the mansion itself was in mourning. Alexander buried himself in work, staying long hours at the office until night blurred into morning. The boardroom became his refuge, spreadsheets his escape, and late-night meetings his shield against the emptiness waiting for him at home. To his employees, he looked like a man consumed by ambition, but behind closed doors, he was only running from grief, from silence, from memories that clung to him like shadows. He often returned home after Ethan was already asleep, his son's innocent face resting peacefully, unaware of the storm within his father's heart. But Ethan felt it. Children always did. Though he said little, his eyes searched for his father at school drop-offs, at breakfast tables, at bedtime. Each absence carved into him a quiet ache, one he didn't know how to express. Claire, seeing the cracks widening in both father and son, became the glue that held what remained of the household together. She rose early to prepare Ethan's meals, braided his hair for school plays, and helped him with homework late into the evenings. Sometimes, when the little boy cried quietly for his mother, Claire would pull him into her arms, humming lullabies Isabella once sang, her own tears hidden in the soft strands of his hair. Alexander noticed her presence in subtle ways. A warm meal left on the dining table, Ethan's laughter floating up from the garden, the gentle knock at his study door when nights grew too heavy. "You have to be strong, Alex," Claire would whisper whenever their eyes met. "Not for yourself, but for Ethan. He needs you." But strength was easier said than lived. The walls of the mansion mocked him with memories. Isabella's voice, Isabella's touch, Isabella's absence. Every corner reminded him of her, and every reminder reopened wounds he wished to numb. Still, through the silence and shadows, life continued. Ethan grew, the seasons shifted, and Claire stood as a constant, her quiet strength bridging the emptiness that Alexander refused to face. The house might have lost its color, but in small ways, through Claire's care and Ethan's resilience. A faint light still flickered in the darkness. The rain fell hard against the wide glass windows of the Williams mansion that night, thunder rumbling faintly in the distance. Inside, the lights glowed dimly, casting long shadows across the grand hall. It was well past midnight when Alexander's car finally pulled into the driveway, weaving slightly as it came to a halt. He stumbled out, his suit wrinkled, the sharp scent of alcohol clinging to him like a second skin. Claire, who had been waiting up in the living room with a book on her lap, jumped to her feet. Her heart tightened at the sight of him, this man who had once been unshakable, now reduced to a hollow figure drowning in his own grief. "Alex," she whispered softly, rushing to his side. "You're drunk." He gave a bitter laugh, the kind that held no humor. "Drunk? Maybe. Alive? Barely." His words slurred, but the pain behind them was unmistakable. He swayed, and she quickly slid her arm under his, guiding him toward the staircase. Step by step, she helped him up, her small frame supporting his tall, weary body. The air between them was thick with unspoken words, with months of loneliness, sorrow, and buried longing. When they finally reached his room, she eased him down onto the bed, removing his shoes with gentle hands. "Thank you," he murmured, his eyes glassy as they searched hers. For a moment, silence hung heavy, broken only by the rain outside. Then, with a sudden vulnerability, he reached out and caught her wrist. "Don't go," he pleaded, his voice raw. "Please, I can't be alone tonight." Claire froze, torn between duty and the ache in her own heart. She had loved Isabella like a sister, but she had also loved Alexander. In secret, in silence, for years. Seeing him broken, needing comfort, something inside her gave way. She sat beside him, her hand trembling as he pulled her closer. "Alex," she began, But the words died on her lips when his arms wrapped around her, desperate and aching. That night, grief blurred the lines of loyalty and friendship. In the darkness of his room, with sorrow clouding judgment, Alexander sought solace in the only warmth near him. And Claire, caught between compassion and desire, did not resist. By morning, the rain had stopped, but guilt lingered like a heavy fog. Alexander awoke with his head pounding, his chest tight with the weight of what he had done. He turned to find Claire beside him, her eyes soft, her lips curved in a small, knowing smile. "Good morning," she whispered, as though nothing about the world had changed. But for Alexander, everything had. Shame clawed at him, telling him he had betrayed Isabella's memory. Yet when Claire reached for his hand, when her touch reminded him of warmth he thought he'd never feel again, he faltered. Against his better judgment, against the voice of guilt, he allowed himself to lean into her presence. And in that fragile, dangerous space between loss and longing, Alexander began to fall. Not just into weakness, but into something he feared might one day consume him entirely. For the first few weeks, Claire seemed like a godsend. She filled the house with the tenderness that Isabella had left behind, stepping into the role of caregiver with grace. To Alexander, she was supportive, warm, and gentle. To Ethan, she was attentive, making sure his meals were ready, his school bag was packed, and his bedtime was not forgotten. It almost seemed as though fate had brought her into their lives for this very reason, to mend the broken pieces of their family. But as the days stretched into weeks, small cracks began to appear in the perfect picture. Alexander, buried in meetings and late nights at the office, rarely noticed. But Ethan did. Children always notice. At first, it was subtle. Claire no longer insisted on driving Ethan to school herself, preferring to hand him off to the driver with a casual excuse. "I'm tired," she would say, waving him off with a forced smile. Then came the missed dinners, when she would retreat to her room with the excuse of headaches, leaving Ethan to eat quietly in the vast dining hall with only the housekeeper for company. The change deepened. Whenever Alexander was around, Claire became the doting guardian, helping Ethan with homework at the dining table, ruffling his hair with a motherly smile, asking about his day. But the moment Alexander's car pulled out of the driveway, her expression hardened. "Stop whining, Ethan," she snapped one afternoon when he asked if she could help him with a school project. "You're old enough to figure it out. Don't bother me." The boy froze, hurt flashing in his eyes. He had grown used to gentle words, to his mother's soothing voice, to Claire's early kindness. But now, the woman he had once trusted frightened him. The bullying crept into small, sharp actions. She would scold him harshly for spilling a little water, glare at him if he laughed too loudly, and send him to his room for disturbing her peace. Some nights, she deliberately ignored him when he cried for his mother, shutting her door to block out the sound. When Alexander returned from work, she would meet him with a smile, arms open, recounting the day with carefully chosen stories. "Ethan is adjusting well," she would assure him. "He misses Isabella, of course, but he's strong." And Alexander, weary and desperate for some hope, believed her. Ethan tried to tell his father once, tugging on his sleeve as Alexander prepared to leave for the office. "Daddy, Claire," he began, his voice trembling. But Claire's sharp look from behind his father silenced him. Fear sealed his lips. The mansion that had once been a home of love now became a stage of masks. To Alexander, Claire remained the supportive friend who helped keep his son's world intact. But to Ethan, she had become something else entirely. A shadow in his mother's place, a woman who smiled in the light but frightened him in the dark. And though Alexander could not yet see it, the fragile foundation of his household was beginning to crack beneath the weight of her deception. The silence of the Williams mansion had begun to worry Alexander. He noticed it most in his son. Ethan, once full of laughter, had grown quiet, withdrawn into himself. He no longer ran to greet his father when he returned from work. Instead, he lingered in corners with his toys, eyes distant, shoulders slumped under a sadness far too heavy for a boy of 7. One evening, Alexander sat at the edge of Ethan's bed, watching him pretend to sleep. He brushed his son's hair gently and whispered, "Talk to me, Ethan. What's wrong?" But Ethan only turned his face into the pillow, whispering one word Alexander barely caught, "Mom." That was the moment Alexander realized his son needed more than he could give. His grief had swallowed him whole, leaving Ethan starved of warmth. And so, after much thought, Alexander made a decision. He would hire someone whose sole purpose was to care for Ethan, someone gentle, patient, and kind. Naomi arrived the following week. She was in her early 20s, with soft brown eyes and a smile that radiated calm. Though young, she carried herself with a maturity that impressed Alexander. On her first day, she knelt down to Ethan's level, her voice soft and reassuring. "Hi, Ethan.
I'm Naomi.
I'm here just for you. Will you let me be your friend?" At first, Ethan only stared at her warily, the echoes of Claire's sharpness still haunting him. But Naomi didn't push. She simply sat beside him, showing him a picture book she had brought, letting him come to her in his own time. Within days, Ethan was following her around the garden, his laughter slowly returning as she chased him through the grass or taught him new songs. Naomi became his safe space. She cooked his favorite meals, patiently helped with homework, and tucked him into bed with stories that ended in giggles rather than tears. For the first time in months, the light of childhood returned to Ethan's eyes. But Claire noticed. From the moment Naomi walked into the house, Claire's smile tightened. At first, she masked her jealousy with false friendliness, but soon her disdain seeped through. She watched with narrowed eyes whenever Ethan clung to Naomi, whenever Alexander praised her for the boy's improvement. One morning, as Naomi prepared Ethan's breakfast, Claire cornered her in the kitchen. Her tone was cold, her words laced with authority. "If you want to stay in this house, you'll do as I say. Wash my clothes, clean my room, and cook my meals. You're just a nanny. Don't forget that." Naomi blinked, startled. "But Mr. Williams hired me to look after Ethan." Claire cut her off sharply. "And I run this house. If you value your job, you'll remember your place." Naomi swallowed her protest. She wasn't there for power or recognition. She was there for Ethan. So she endured Claire's mistreatment quietly, scrubbing her laundry late at night, preparing her meals in silence, all while pouring her real energy into caring for the boy. Yet beneath her calm obedience, Naomi sensed danger. Claire's eyes followed her like a hawk, sharp with unspoken threats. It was clear Claire did not see her as a helper, but as a rival. And though Alexander remained blind to the storm brewing under his roof, it was only a matter of time before the clash between the two women could no longer be hidden. Naomi had grown used to the rhythms of the Williams mansion, but one rhythm troubled her most: Ethan's silence. The boy who had begun to laugh again in her care slowly retreated back into a shell whenever Claire's presence filled the room. Naomi noticed the way his shoulders stiffened if Claire's voice rang through the hallway, how he quickly hid behind his books or toys, and how his smiles disappeared as though swallowed by shadows. Around his father, Ethan remained quiet too. Alexander, still blinded by grief and guilt, assumed his son's silence was simply part of mourning Isabella. He would often pat Ethan's head and say, "He just needs time." But Naomi's instincts told her otherwise. This wasn't only sadness, it was fear. One night, after Ethan's bedtime story, Naomi lingered by his side. The moonlight poured through the window, casting pale silver across his small frame. Ethan lay curled up, his little hands clutching his blanket tightly, as if it were a shield. Naomi sat gently on the edge of the bed, brushing his hair back from his forehead. "Ethan," she said softly, "can I ask you something?" His eyes flickered toward hers but quickly darted away. "You're very brave," Naomi continued, her voice calm, almost like a lullaby. "But I can see something is hurting you. You don't have to tell me if you don't want to. I just need you to know I'm here, for you, always." For a long moment, there was only silence, broken by the faint chirping of crickets outside. Then Ethan shifted, turning toward her with eyes that glistened with unshed tears. His small voice trembled when he whispered, "Naomi, can I trust you not to tell anyone?" Naomi's heart ached at the fragility in his tone. She took his tiny hand in hers and nodded solemnly. You can trust me, Ethan. Whatever you say will stay with me. I promise. His lips quivered, and the tears he had been holding back finally spilled down his cheeks. I don't like Claire, he whispered shakily. When Daddy isn't here, she yells at me. Sometimes she says I'm annoying. She tells me Mommy wouldn't have wanted me around. His chest heaved as the words tumbled out, each one breaking Naomi's heart. She scares me. Naomi froze, her blood running cold. She had suspected cruelty, but hearing it confirmed from Ethan's own trembling lips tore at her. She hugged him tightly, letting him cry into her shoulder. Oh, sweetheart, she murmured, rocking him gently. You didn't deserve any of that. None of it. You were loved. Do you hear me? You are so loved. Ethan nodded against her chest, clinging to her as if afraid she might vanish too. Naomi held him until his breathing steadied and sleep finally claimed him, his small hand still gripping hers. When she finally slipped out of the room, Naomi's mind raced. She had sworn to keep his secret, but how long could she remain silent? Alexander needed to know, yet she feared the storm that revelation would bring. For now, she decided one thing. She would not let Ethan suffer alone. Even if it meant standing against Claire herself, Naomi would protect him. The mansion had long grown used to silence, but that night, Naomi sensed a different kind of heaviness. Ethan had been unusually quiet at dinner, his little fork pushing food around the plate while his eyes stayed lowered. Claire had sat across from him, her smile sugary sweet as Alexander asked about his day. But Naomi noticed how Ethan barely touched his meal, how his shoulders hunched as though carrying an invisible weight. Later that night, when Claire had retired to her room and Alexander remained locked away in his study, Naomi tucked Ethan into bed. She kissed his forehead and began to rise, but his small hand caught hers, trembling. Naomi, he whispered, his voice tight with fear. She sat back down instantly, her eyes soft and steady. What is it, Ethan? You can tell me. For a long moment, the boy just stared at her, his eyes glistening under the dim glow of the night light. Then, with a shaky breath, he leaned closer and whispered words that made Naomi's heart freeze. I heard Claire talking once, when she thought no one was there. His voice cracked, and he clutched the blanket tighter. She said she killed Mommy. She said she poisoned her, little by little, so no one would know. Naomi's blood ran cold. Her mouth went dry as her mind tried to process the horror of his words. Ethan, she whispered, her voice almost breaking. Are you sure? What exactly did you hear? His eyes brimmed with tears. She was in her room, talking to herself. She said she hated Mommy, that Mommy had everything. Then she laughed and said no one would ever suspect. But I made a noise, and she saw me. His little body shook with the memory. She grabbed me and said, if you tell anyone, you'll lose your father too. I'll make sure of it. Naomi felt her stomach twist with rage and terror. She pulled Ethan into her arms, holding him tightly as his small frame quivered. Oh, sweetheart, she whispered fiercely. I believe you, and I promise I will protect you. You are safe with me. But even as she spoke, her mind raced. If what Ethan said was true, Isabella's death had not been a tragic illness, but a calculated murder. And if Claire had threatened Ethan, then his silence all these months suddenly made sense. That night, long after Ethan had fallen asleep with his tiny hand wrapped around hers, Naomi sat awake in the dark. Her heart pounded, her mind replaying Ethan's words again and again. She wanted to run to Alexander, to tell him everything, but she remembered Ethan's terrified plea. Can I trust you not to tell anyone? Naomi was caught in an impossible choice. To remain silent meant letting Claire's shadow loom over the boy she had come to love as her own. But to speak out could mean danger, not just for her, but for Ethan as well. As dawn approached, Naomi knew one thing for certain. Sleep would not come, not with such a secret burning in her chest. And somewhere down the hall, behind closed doors, Claire slept peacefully, while the weight of her crime threatened to destroy them all. The sun hung lazily over the Williams estate, casting shimmering light across the crystal blue pool in the backyard. It should have been a normal afternoon, but beneath the calm surface of the water, danger waited. Claire had grown restless. Naomi's presence in the house gnawed at her, the bond she shared with Ethan burning like a thorn in her side. So when Alexander left for the office that morning, and Naomi was sent on errands, Claire found the moment she had been waiting for. "Come outside, Ethan," she said sweetly, masking her venom behind a smile. "Let's enjoy some fresh air." Ethan hesitated, his small eyes wary, but fear of disobeying her kept him silent. He followed reluctantly to the poolside, clutching his toy car in one hand. Claire crouched beside him, her eyes glittering with something dark. "You know, Ethan," she said in a voice that dripped with false kindness, "you should learn to swim. Don't you think so?" Before he could answer, her hands shoved hard against his small back. A scream tore from his throat as he plunged into the deep water, his toy car sinking with him. The pool swallowed him whole, bubbles rising as his tiny body flailed desperately. From the balcony above, Alexander had just returned early from a canceled meeting. He froze at the sight below, his son thrashing in the water. His heart stopped. In seconds, he was rushing down the stairs and out into the yard, panic coursing through him. But before he could leap into the pool, Claire shrieked theatrically, "Ethan!" and dove in after him. She pulled him to the edge, coughing and gasping, playing the role of savior. By the time Alexander reached them, she was already holding the boy in her arms, her voice trembling with fake tears. "He slipped," she cried, water dripping from her hair. "Oh, Alex, thank God I was here. He could have drowned." Alexander's heart pounded in his chest, torn between fear and relief. He knelt beside them, pulling Ethan close. "Are you all right, son? You're safe now." But Ethan's reaction stopped him cold. The boy shoved away from Claire's grasp and stumbled straight into Alexander's arms, sobbing. Then, when he noticed Naomi returning through the gate with grocery bags, he broke free entirely and ran to her, burying his face into her dress, trembling. "Naomi," he wailed, "don't leave me again. Please don't leave me." Claire's smile faltered for the briefest second before she forced it back. But Alexander saw it, the crack in her mask. He looked from Naomi cradling his son, whispering comfort into his ear, to Claire dripping by the poolside, her eyes darting nervously. Something stirred in Alexander's chest. Doubt. He had long believed Ethan's silence was only grief. But the terror in his son's voice, the way he clung to Naomi as though his very life depended on her, whispered a truth he could no longer ignore. That evening, when the house quieted, Alexander replayed the scene in his mind. His son's eyes had spoken volumes. Fear when looking at Claire, safety only in Naomi's arms. And for the first time since Isabella's death, Alexander began to wonder if the shadows in his home were darker than grief. Alexander Williams had built empires from the ground up, mastered boardrooms where men twice his age had fallen, and faced competitors who would have crushed lesser men. Yet nothing prepared him for the quiet battle inside his own home. In the weeks following the pool incident, something shifted within him. Where once he had buried himself in work, now he began to look more carefully at his son, at the people surrounding him. Ethan's behavior had become too consistent to ignore. When Naomi was present, the boy's laughter filled the mansion once again. Light, innocent, and pure. He would run across the garden, his small hand tucked into Naomi's, or giggle uncontrollably as she tickled him during story time. Alexander hadn't heard that kind of joy in months, not since Isabella's death. But the moment Claire entered the room, Ethan's entire demeanor changed. His smile would falter, his shoulders slump, and his eyes, those wide, searching eyes, would dim with a shadow of fear. Sometimes he would freeze altogether, as if bracing himself for something unseen. It was like watching sunlight vanish behind storm clouds. Alexander tried to explain it away at first. Perhaps Ethan was still adjusting. Perhaps he associated Claire too much with Isabella's illness, with nights spent by the bedside of a dying mother. But the father in him, the man who knew his son better than anyone else, could no longer deny what he saw. This was not grief. This was dread. At dinners, he watched closely. Naomi would gently coax Ethan to eat, playing games with spoonfuls of rice until the boy giggled and gave in. Claire, on the other hand, often glared at the child when she thought no one was watching. Alexander caught it once. A fleeting look, sharp and cold, before her lips curled back into a sweet smile when she noticed his eyes on her. It unsettled him, that split second where her mask slipped. Doubt began to creep in, gnawing at the edges of his loyalty. He remembered the whispers of Isabella's parents, their harsh accusations of foul play, and how he had dismissed them as grief-stricken paranoia. But now he wondered, had they seen something he had been too blind to notice? Naomi carried her own burden in silence. She knew the truth of Claire's cruelty. Worse, the horrifying confession Ethan had whispered to her. Yet she held her tongue, waiting for the right moment, knowing that speaking too soon without proof could backfire. She could not risk Alexander dismissing her, or worse, confronting Claire unprepared. For now, her mission was simple: protect Ethan. And so she hovered like a guardian, her gentle presence giving the boy courage in the face of the shadows lurking in his home. Alexander, however, was no fool. Years in business had sharpened his instincts, and those instincts now screamed that something was wrong. One evening, as he stood in the doorway of Ethan's room, he watched his son sleep peacefully with Naomi seated beside him, humming softly. A warmth stirred in Alexander's chest. Gratitude, admiration, and something deeper. Yet behind that warmth lay an ache of betrayal. How could he have missed this? How could he have let his son suffer silently under his very nose? As he closed the door quietly, Alexander made a silent vow. Whatever truth lay hidden in the walls of his mansion, he would uncover it. For his son, for Isabella, for himself. The awakening had begun. The morning was unusually still at the Williams mansion. The household staff moved with quiet unease, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Alexander sat in the grand living room, nursing a cup of untouched coffee, when the heavy doors opened. Mr. and Mrs. Carter stepped in, dressed in somber black, their faces pale but resolute. In the father's hand was a manila envelope. He placed it firmly on the glass table before Alexander, his voice hoarse but steady. "The results," Mr. Carter said. "We demanded an autopsy, and now the truth cannot be hidden." Alexander's hand trembled as he opened the file. His eyes scanned the pages, and each word struck him like a dagger. Traces of a rare, slow-killing poison, consistent doses over weeks, deliberate tampering with prescribed medication. His blood ran cold. His Isabella had not been claimed by illness. She had been murdered. The paper slipped from his fingers. "No!" His voice cracked, his chest heaving with rage and disbelief. Who would? Who could? Then the pieces began to fall into place. Claire. She had been the one managing Isabella's medications. She had lived under his roof, claiming to care for Isabella, all while tightening death's grip around her. His jaw clenched as fury replaced grief. As if on cue, Claire entered, her usual saccharine smile plastered on her face. But when she saw the open file on the table and Alexander's blazing eyes, her mask faltered. "You think she began, feigning shock. "Alex, you can't believe this. I loved Isabella like a sister." "Enough!" Alexander thundered, his voice echoing through the room. "Only you had access to her medication. Only you could have done this." Claire's lips quivered, scrambling for excuses. But before she could spin another lie, Naomi stepped forward, her hand gently resting on Ethan's shoulder. "There's something you need to hear," Naomi said softly. She looked down at Ethan, her eyes full of encouragement. "It's time, sweetheart. Tell your father the truth." Ethan's small frame trembled, his fingers twisting nervously. His eyes darted toward Claire, fear flashing in them. But Naomi's gentle nod gave him strength. With quivering lips, he whispered, "Daddy, I heard her. She said she killed Mommy with poison. When she saw me, She told me if I told anyone, I'd lose you too. She scared me every day. She pushed me in the pool. She said Mommy never wanted me. The room fell silent, every word piercing deeper than the last. Tears welled in Alexander's eyes as he pulled his son into his arms. His gaze shifted to Claire, no longer the trusted friend, but a serpent in their midst. Claire's face twisted, her lies unraveling as the truth stood bare. And for the first time, Alexander saw her clearly, not as a savior, but as the shadow that had destroyed his family from within. The silence in the living room was suffocating. Every eye was fixed on Claire, whose once carefully maintained mask of sweetness and composure had cracked. Her chest rose and fell rapidly, her face pale, her hands trembling. For a moment, she tried to cling to denial, but Ethan's trembling words and the damning autopsy report had stripped her of every defense. Alexander stood tall, his arm wrapped protectively around his son. His eyes, usually warm and kind, burned with fury. "Say something," he demanded, his voice sharp as steel. "Tell me it isn't true." Claire's lips parted, but no lie came. Instead, her face twisted, and with a sudden cry, she collapsed onto her knees, clutching at the edge of the table as sobs racked her body. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but they carried no innocence, only bitterness and resentment. "Yes," she screamed, her voice hoarse. "Yes, I did it. I poisoned her." Gasps filled the room. The staff in the corners recoiled. Isabella's parents clutched each other tightly, and Alexander froze as the truth shattered what little was left of his trust. Claire's confession spilled out like venom. "Do you know what it was like? Watching her live the life I dreamed of. You had everything, wealth, power, and her. Isabella had what should have been mine. I loved you, Alex. I loved you from the beginning, and you never even looked at me." Her sobs turned to hysterical laughter, echoing off the mansion's walls. "So I made my choice. If I couldn't have you, then she wouldn't either. I took her from you, slowly, carefully, right under your nose. And when she was gone, I knew you'd be mine. I comfort you, care for your son, slip into the place she left behind. Soon you'd see me not as her friend, but as your wife." Alexander's fists clenched, his voice shaking with rage. "You murdered the woman I loved, Ethan's mother, because of your jealousy? You threatened my son, pushed him into a pool, all because of your twisted obsession." Claire's eyes flickered with a dangerous glint. "Ethan?" she hissed, glaring at the boy cowering in Naomi's arms. "He was in the way, constant reminder of Isabella. Disposable. Once I gave you a child of my own, you'd forget him." Naomi gasped, holding Ethan tighter as his small body shook with fear. Alexander stepped forward, his face pale with fury and heartbreak. "You disgust me," he growled. "Every tear, every kind word, every moment. You were a viper hiding in plain sight. You wanted to destroy everything Isabella and I built. But you will never touch my son again." Claire sobbed harder, her twisted confession hanging heavy in the air. But one thing was certain, the illusion was gone, and the truth of her monstrous betrayal stood naked before them all. The mansion, once a place of love and memory, now trembled under the weight of betrayal and truth. The sound of sirens pierced the stillness of the estate, drawing closer until red and blue lights flickered across the marble walls. Moments later, the heavy knock of authority thundered at the front door. 2 officers entered, their faces stern and their voices commanding. Alexander, still rigid with shock, handed them the autopsy report. Isabella's parents confirmed their suspicions with tearful nods, and Naomi added her quiet voice. Speaking of Ethan's testimony, the officers turned to Claire. Her face had twisted into a storm of desperation. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she shrieked, "No! You don't understand. I did it for him. For Alex." Her cries echoed through the mansion, desperate and haunting. She struggled against the officer's grip, her eyes wild, her hair disheveled, no longer the polished woman who had once pretended to care. "Alex!" she screamed, her voice breaking. "I loved you. Everything I did. I did for you. If Isabella hadn't been there, you would have seen me. You would have been mine. Alexander stood motionless, his face pale, his chest heaving. Fury burned in his eyes, but beneath it was disbelief. A sickening ache that someone he had once trusted could harbor such darkness. His hands trembled, but he forced himself to stay still, for Ethan's sake. Isabella's parents clung to each other, their sobs rising as years of grief found their cruel answer. The truth brought no comfort, only more sorrow for the daughter they had lost. Meanwhile, Naomi knelt beside Ethan, cradling him close as his small body shook with sobs. "You're safe now," she whispered, brushing his hair gently. "No one will ever hurt you again." As the front doors slammed shut behind the officers, Claire's screams fading into the distance, a heavy silence fell. Justice had arrived, but the scars left behind would take far longer to heal. The storm had finally passed. For weeks, the mansion had been gripped by grief, suspicion, and betrayal, but now the shadows began to lift. Claire was gone, taken by the authorities, her screams no longer echoing through the hallways. What remained was silence, different this time, not heavy with fear, but quiet with the fragile possibility of peace. Alexander sat on the floor of the living room, his suit jacket discarded, his eyes red from tears. Before him stood Ethan, small and weary, the weight of secrets far too heavy for a child. Slowly, Alexander knelt down, lowering himself until he was eye level with his son. His voice trembled as he spoke. "You carried this pain to protect me," he whispered, tears streaming freely. "My brave boy, I am so sorry. I should have seen. I should have known." Ethan's lip quivered before the dam broke, and he rushed into his father's arms. "I didn't want you to die too, Daddy," he cried, his voice muffled against Alexander's chest. "She said she would take you away if I told." Alexander held him tightly, as if shielding him from every shadow that remained. "No one will ever take me from you," he vowed, his tears mingling with his son's. "You are all I have, Ethan. You are my heart. You saved me more than you'll ever know." Nearby, Naomi watched, her own eyes shining with tears. She had carried Ethan's secret when no one else could, standing as his protector when the world had turned cruel. Alexander turned toward her, his voice thick with gratitude. "Thank you, Naomi," he said, his gaze steady, "for being the mother my son needed when I couldn't see the truth. You saved him. You saved us both." Naomi's hand pressed against her chest, humbled, her only answer a quiet nod. In that moment, Isabella's parents stepped forward. Their faces were lined with grief, but also with humility. Mrs. Carter's voice cracked as she spoke. "We judged you wrongly, Alexander. In our pain, we accused you of what you never could have done. Please, forgive us." Alexander's eyes softened. "You lost your daughter. I could never hold that against you." The air in the mansion shifted, heavy sorrow giving way to cautious healing. Ethan smiled faintly through his tears, his hand never leaving his father's. Naomi stayed close, her presence a gentle anchor. And for the first time since Isabella's death, a flicker of hope glowed in the Williams home. Not because grief had vanished, it never truly would, but because love, real and selfless, had begun to mend the broken pieces of their hearts. Months passed, and the Williams mansion slowly began to breathe again. The echoes of grief and betrayal had not vanished, but they no longer defined the home. Instead, laughter, gentle at first, then brighter each day, began to fill its halls once more. Ethan blossomed under Naomi's care. Where once his eyes had been clouded with fear, now they shone with the innocence of a boy rediscovering joy. He played in the gardens again, splashing in the fountains, running through the halls with toy airplanes that buzzed like laughter in the air. Each evening, Alexander made sure to be home to read him a story or simply hold him close, keeping the promise he had made to Isabella, to love their son with all his heart. Naomi became more than a nanny. She was Ethan's safe space, his confidant, the one who taught him not only homework but also how to heal. To Alexander, she was a quiet strength, the woman who had stood in the storm when he had been blind to it. Slowly, a bond grew between them, something fragile, born not of desperation but of trust, respect, and love that asked for nothing in return. Isabella's parents visited often, no longer with suspicion, but with warmth. They watched Ethan with tearful smiles, grateful that their grandson was safe, that he was learning to laugh again. Though they still mourned their daughter deeply, they found comfort knowing her son was surrounded by love. One evening, as the sun set in shades of gold and crimson, Alexander stood in the garden with Ethan on his shoulders. Naomi watched from the steps, a soft smile on her lips. Ethan's laughter rang out, free and unburdened, and Alexander looked up at his son, then back at Naomi. For the first time in what felt like forever, hope no longer flickered like a fragile flame. It burned steady, warm, and strong. Isabella would never be forgotten. Her memory lived on in Ethan's smile and in the lessons of love she had left behind. But life had given Alexander and his son a second chance. A chance to heal, to grow, and perhaps, in time, to love again. And as night fell over the Williams estate, the house that had once echoed with sorrow now whispered of new beginnings.